It's a Tuesday morning in Indiana, 1962. The alarm hasn't rung yet, but she's already up. There's coffee on the gas burner, and the kitchen smells like yesterday's bread, and something faintly floral. Her face cream, maybe, or the sachet she keeps in the linen drawer. She moves quietly so she doesn't wake the children. She opens the second drawer of the oak dresser. And there it is, folded just so. That particular shade of dusty rose that everything seemed to come in back then. She picks it up, steps in, pulls it smooth, and snaps the garter clips into place. That soft, firm snap. It meant she was dressed. It meant she was ready. It meant she was going out into the world. Nobody told her she had to. Nobody needed to.
Every woman had one. Your grandmother had one. Her mother had one before her. From the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, the everyday girdle was as unremarkable a part of getting dressed as putting on shoes. Women wore them to the grocery store, to school plays, to afternoon errands in the heat of July. And then, quietly, with no formal announcement, they disappeared. From the dresser drawers, from the department store floors, from daily life entirely. Most people today have no idea how completely this garment once defined what it meant for a woman to be dressed. Today, we're going back to find out why and what, quietly, went with it when it left. Most women in the 1950s didn't call it a girdle when they were talking to each other. They called it their foundation. That word matters. A foundation isn't an accessory. It's structural. It's what everything else is built on. The girdle, the long line bra, the full slip. Together, these were called foundation garments. And they were sold in their own hushed section of every department store, away from the bright colors and the window displays. A saleswoman your mother's age would measure you, advise you, and send you home with exactly what you needed. The language alone tells you how seriously women took this. Not vanity, foundation. If you were shopping for a girdle in 1955, you had opinions about brands. Playtex made theirs from latex, smooth, firm, that dusty rose color, and sold them in a distinctive cylindrical tube at the drugstore counter. Warner's was considered more refined, sold at department stores, recommended by the saleswoman in the foundation section who knew your name. Maidenform ran advertisements so bold for their time that women still remember them decades later. These weren't generic products. They had personalities. Women were loyal to their brand, the way people today are loyal to a phone company, except the relationship was considerably more personal and considerably more daily. Because choosing your foundation wasn't shopping. It was, in its quiet way, deciding who you intended to be when you walked out the door. Here is something that genuinely surprises people today. Girls weren't eased into foundation garments gradually. In many households and communities across America, a girl began wearing a girdle as a young teenager, sometimes as young as 13 or 14, as a natural part of crossing into womanhood. Picture a mother and daughter on a Saturday morning, walking together into the foundation section of a department store. The daughter a little uncertain, the mother entirely calm. The saleswoman smiles like she's seen this 1,000 times, because she has. She takes the girl's measurements with the same unhurried efficiency she'd use for any adult customer. There was even a kind of pride in it, the same complicated pride that surrounded a lot of female rites of passage back then. Strange to think about now, but true. And this one surprised me the most, if I'm honest. We assume from this distance that wearing a firm elastic garment every single day must have been quietly miserable. But women who lived it consistently say the same thing. After the first few minutes,
you forgot it was there. Comfort, in the 1950s sense, wasn't about physical ease. It was about social ease, about moving through the world without self-consciousness. The girdle, paradoxically, gave many women a kind of confidence that felt like freedom, even as it restricted movement. Not because they were fooled, but because the feeling of being pulled together was, for them, genuinely comforting. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Every city and every decent-sized town had at least one department store with a proper foundation department. And the experience of being fitted there was nothing like shopping today. You didn't browse alone. You didn't guess your size. A trained fitter, almost always a woman of a certain age, almost always wearing her own foundation garments, almost always with a cloth measuring tape around her neck, would assess you with professional calm and bring you options. She'd tell you what you needed and why. There was no embarrassment in this transaction. It was clinical, warm, and entirely matter-of-fact. The fitting room smelled like face powder and new elastic. You left knowing exactly what you were supposed to buy. You cannot fully understand the girdle without understanding stockings, because for most of this era, they were inseparable. Nylon stockings required garters to stay up, and garters required either a garter belt or, more practically, a girdle with built-in suspenders. This meant that for women who wore stockings every day, which was most women in most public situations, the girdle wasn't optional in any practical sense. It was the infrastructure. Remove the girdle, and the stockings came down. Remove the stockings, and you were, in most social contexts, underdressed. The whole system was interlocking, which is perhaps part of why when one piece finally fell away, the rest followed quickly. Not all girdles were the same, and not all women wore the same ones. A woman working a factory floor in Detroit wore a different garment, cheaper, more practical, possibly hand-washed every evening and hung to dry overnight, than a woman in suburban Connecticut whose husband managed a bank. The luxury end had lace trim, boning, real craftsmanship. The practical end was pure function. But here is the remarkable thing. Both women wore one. The girdle crossed class lines almost entirely. Rich, working class, farm wife, city secretary. The expectation was universal, even when the quality was not. There is something quietly democratic about that, even if the reasons behind it were far more complicated. Women's magazines in the 1950s were extraordinarily specific about foundation garments. Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's. They ran advertisements, full-page illustrations of serene women in pale pink foundations, with names like The Little Goddess and The Merry Widow. But they also ran editorial content, advice columns, fitting guides. You can imagine a woman at her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, the children in bed, turning the glossy pages of her Ladies' Home Journal under the lamp, pausing at an article titled, "Is Your Foundation Working for You?" and reading it with the same practical attention she'd give a recipe. The messaging was never cruel. It was maternal, almost. Here is what you need. Here is how to care for it. Here is why it matters. If you wore a girdle every day, and you did, you washed it every night. This was simply understood. You came home, you changed, you hand-washed your foundation in the bathroom sink with a mild soap, and you draped it over the towel bar or the shower rod to dry overnight. By morning, it was ready. This was not considered a burden. It was just part of the routine, like washing your face or setting your hair. The elastic lasted longer with hand washing than with machine washing, and women knew this instinctively. There is something in that daily ritual, the care of the garment, the quiet discipline of it, that feels very far away from the way most of us relate to our clothes today. Somewhere in the mid 1960s, the girdles stopped being invisible and started being noticed. And once something is noticed, it can be questioned. It started gently, a comedian's throwaway line, a character on a television program, a magazine column that asked, carefully, whether all of this was really necessary. The humor was always aimed at the garment, never quite at the women who wore it, but the effect was the same. Once you've laughed at something, it's harder to take seriously. The girdle didn't disappear because women rebelled overnight. It disappeared because, very slowly, it became something you could imagine not doing. And once that thought was possible, it was only a matter of time. I'll be honest, I don't think it was a simple story. I think it was a very human one. In 1959, a man named Allen Gant Sr. introduced something called panty legs. Within a few years, pantyhose, as they came to be known, were in department stores across America, and they changed everything. Here is why. Pantyhose replaced stockings and removed the practical need for a garter belt in a single stroke. For the first time, a woman could wear smooth, sheer leg coverage with no clips, no suspenders, no foundation garment required for structural support. The last mechanical reason to wear a girdle had quietly disappeared. But the cultural reason took longer to follow. For many women, particularly those over 40, those in smaller towns, those whose mothers had fitted them for their first foundation and considered it a kind of inheritance, pantyhose alone wasn't enough reason to abandon the girdle. Habit is powerful. So is identity. The girdle had been part of how these women understood themselves as dressed, as adult, as put together. You don't let go of that because a new product arrived at the five and dime. There was a woman who taught fifth grade down the hall from me for 11 years. Vera Kundert. Sturdy woman. Sensible shoes. Never a hair out of place. One hot June morning, last day of school, 1964, she walked into the teacher's lounge, set down her coffee, reached under her skirt, peeled off her girdle right there by the Folgers tin, held it up like a victory flag, and dropped it in the waste bin. Every woman in that room just stared. And then someone started clapping, and we all did. Vera smoothed her skirt, picked up her coffee, and said one word. Summer. I've thought about Vera probably 100 times since, because she wasn't making a political statement. She wasn't burning anything. She was just a tired fifth grade teacher on the last day of school who had finally, simply decided she was done. And somehow that small, private decision, made in a teacher's lounge in Indiana over a tin of Folgers, was happening in kitchens and bedrooms and fitting rooms all across America at almost exactly the same time. That's how change usually comes. Not all at once, just one woman at a time, deciding enough. It's worth saying clearly, not every woman let go. There were women, and there still are, who wore a foundation garment every day of their adult lives, right through the 1970s and beyond, and never once considered stopping. For them, it wasn't restriction. It was simply how you dressed. Some of these women were deeply traditional. Some were just deeply comfortable with their own routine. Some had worn one for so long that leaving the house without it felt genuinely wrong, the way it might feel to leave without your shoes. We talk sometimes as if the 1960s freed all women simultaneously. It didn't. Freedom, like most things, arrived unevenly and meant different things to different people. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. Not a corset. That's a different century and a different conversation. The everyday 1950s girdle was a high-waisted elastic garment, usually ending mid-thigh, made of a firm nylon and rubber blend in white, beige, or that dusty rose. Think of a woman standing at her dresser mirror, holding it up to the morning light before stepping in. checking the garter clips, smoothing the seams, the whole quiet inspection taking perhaps 30 seconds before the day officially began. Some had light boning along the sides. Some had a panty-style bottom. Some were open. The whole garment weighed almost nothing. It looked, in its drawer, almost delicate. It's strange that something so small held so much expectation inside it.
The girdle didn't leave dramatically. There was no national moment, no headline. It just thinned out. By the early 1970s, the foundation sections of department stores were smaller. The brand advertisements in the magazines were fewer. The saleswomen who knew your name were retiring and not being replaced. Younger women who'd come of age in the late 60s, simply never adopted the habit their mothers had. And when a habit skips a generation, it rarely comes back. The girdle became, within the span of perhaps 15 years, something your mother wore, and then something your grandmother wore, and then something nobody wore at all. The dresser drawers quietly emptied, and life went on, as it does.
When the girdle went, something else went with it that's harder to name. Not the restriction. Good riddance to that part, honestly. But the intention. The idea that going out into the world required a certain preparation. That your appearance in public was a kind of courtesy. A way of saying, I knew I was going to see you, and I dressed accordingly. We've traded that in, most of us, for comfort and ease and practicality. And most days, that trade was worth it. But I think about those women sometimes. The ones who got up before the alarm, who stood at the oak dresser in the quiet morning, who snapped those garter clips with the particular small sound that meant the day had officially begun. They were not vain. They were not oppressed, at least not only by a garment. They were strong and funny and tired and complicated. The girdle was just a small piece of a very large life. I hope, if you've watched this far, that you feel something gentle toward those women. Not pity. They would not have wanted pity, and they wouldn't have understood it. But tenderness, maybe, for what they carried, practically and in every other sense. For the quiet discipline of their mornings. For the way they moved through ordinary days with a kind of intention that seems, from here, almost beautiful. The girdle is gone. The women who wore it are mostly gone too, or getting there. But they left things behind, not in museums, in us, in the way some of us still fold things just so. Still take a moment before going out. Still feel, somewhere in the chest, that small insistence. If you're going to be in the world today, be present in it. I think about my mother's dresser drawer. That dusty rose color. That soft, firm snap. And I think she was a whole person, with a whole life. It was harder and funnier and more complicated than I ever fully knew. We all were. We all are. What did the women in your family wear? And what did they quietly teach you without ever saying a word? If something in this video brought back a memory, a mother, a grandmother, a drawer you haven't thought about in years, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And if you'd like to stay in this world a little longer, there's a video waiting for you about the beauty rituals women swore by before any of us had ever heard of a skincare routine. It's quieter than you'd expect. I think you'll like it.